Find out who really pulled the trigger on November 22nd, 1963, the assassination that changed the world and the cover-up that still haunts us today.
Chapter 1. The Last Morning in Dallas.
The morning of November 22, 1963, broke clear and cold over the Texas plains, the kind of crystalline autumn day that feels deceptively peaceful, the kind that history has a habit of choosing for its most violent ruptures. At Dallas Love Field, Air Force One touched down at 11:37 a.m., and when the doors opened, the man who stepped into the Texas sunlight was more than a president. He was a symbol, young, magnetic, impossibly alive, the embodiment of an American optimism that the Cold War hadn't yet managed to extinguish. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, descended the stairs with his wife Jacqueline beside him, her pink Chanel suit brilliant against the blue November sky. The crowd roared, women wept, men pressed forward to shake his hand. Whatever political tensions had brought him to Dallas, the feuding Texas Democrats, the hostile oil barons, the right-wing radicals who had plastered the city with wanted for treason flyers bearing his photograph, none of it seemed to matter in the warm wash of that crowd's adoration.
But Dallas was not a friendly city for John Kennedy. It was the city where, just 1 month earlier, United Nations Ambassador Adlai Stevenson had been spat upon and struck with a protest sign. It was a city electrified with a particular kind of right-wing fury, the fury of men who believed Kennedy was soft on communism, who hated his negotiations with Khrushchev, who despised his restraint in Cuba. The Secret Service had identified Dallas as a city of elevated risk. Some of Kennedy's own advisors had urged him not to go. Pierre Salinger, his press secretary, would later describe a premonition of danger that hung over the trip like smoke. Yet, Kennedy had insisted. He was a politician, and politicians need crowds. The presidential motorcade was arranged with maximum visibility in mind. Open limousines, slow speeds, a route through the densest urban corridors. The Secret Service had done a security sweep, but the sweep was cursory by modern standards. No one cleared the buildings along the route. No rooftop snipers were stationed to protect the president, and the route itself had been changed at the last moment, altered from the original plan to wind through Dealey Plaza, a small urban park at the junction of several streets, flanked on one side by a grassy knoll with a wooden picket fence, and on another by a 7-story building called the Texas School Book Depository. In that building, on the 6th floor, an employee named Lee Harvey Oswald had spent the morning stacking boxes of school books into what investigators would later call a sniper's nest. Or so the official story goes.
What happened in the next 90 seconds would shatter the certainties of a generation. As the presidential limousine, a midnight blue Lincoln Continental convertible, turned from Houston Street onto Elm Street and began its gentle descent past the depository, shots rang out. Jacqueline Kennedy would later describe looking over at her husband and seeing a blank and vacant expression cross his face before he lurched forward. Governor John Connally, seated ahead of Kennedy, was also struck. The limousine accelerated, the Secret Service agents scrambled, and at 1 p.m. at Parkland Memorial Hospital, the 35th President of the United States was pronounced dead. Chapter 2. The man they called a Patsy. To understand the assassination of John F. Kennedy, you must first understand Lee Harvey Oswald.
and understanding Lee Harvey Oswald is perhaps the most disorienting task in the entire landscape of American political history. He is simultaneously the most investigated man in the history of the United States and the most enigmatic. The official account presents him as a troubled loner, a failed idealist, a man of marginal intelligence and grandiose ambitions who seized a moment of historical opportunity. The conspiracy evidence presents something far more unsettling, a man who appears at every critical juncture of his short life to have been connected to the apparatus of American intelligence in ways that were never fully explained. Oswald was born in New Orleans in 1939, 2 months after his father's death, raised in poverty by a domineering mother who moved him repeatedly through the American South. He was a voracious reader, particularly of socialist and Marxist texts, a loner who never quite fit anywhere, a young man whose ideological convictions seemed to shift and bend like smoke. He joined the U.S. Marine Corps at 17 and was trained as a radar operator at Atsugi Air Base in Japan, a facility that served as a base of operations for the CIA's top-secret U-2 spy plane program. This detail would later fascinate researchers. A young Marine with Marxist sympathies, trained in radar, working in proximity to the most sensitive intelligence operation of the Cold War. His fellow Marines noticed that he seemed to study the Russian language in his spare time, using a self-teaching record. They called him Oswaldskovich.
In October 1959, Oswald walked into the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and announced his intention to defect to the Soviet Union. He offered, in a document he presented to embassy officials, to share whatever classified information he possessed, including, potentially, details about U-2 operations. The KGB debriefed him extensively. The Soviets, suspicious of his real motives, eventually settled him in Minsk, gave him a small apartment, an above-average salary, and work in a radio factory. He married Marina Prusakova, a young Soviet woman, in 1961, and then, with inexplicable ease, the State Department allowed him to return to the United States in 1962. A man who had defected to the Soviet Union during the most paranoid years of the Cold War, who had offered classified information to the enemy, who returned without prosecution, without arrest, without even significant surveillance. The CIA later claimed it had no file on Oswald. The claim defies credibility. Back in the United States, Oswald settled in New Orleans, where he engaged in a series of activities that seemed designed to establish a very specific public identity. He distributed pro-Castro leaflets for a fictitious organization called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, an organization whose address, investigators later discovered, shared a building with a private detective agency with CIA connections. He appeared on local radio debates defending Cuba. He was observed in public confrontations with anti-Castro Cuban exiles. And yet, simultaneously, there is evidence, documentary evidence, witness testimony, photographs, suggesting that Oswald was also meeting privately with the very anti-Castro groups he was publicly opposing. In the autumn of 1963, he traveled to Mexico City, where CIA surveillance cameras photographed a man entering both the Soviet and Cuban embassies. The CIA later claimed the photographs were not of Oswald. If not, who was using his name?
On November 22, while the world focused on Dealey Plaza, Oswald, if we follow the official timeline, returned to his rooming house, retrieved a revolver, and then shot Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit on a suburban street 45 minutes after the assassination. He was arrested at the Texas Theater, where employees had called police after noticing a man duck inside without paying. In custody, he was cool, collected, and consistent. He denied killing Kennedy. He denied killing Tippit. He asked for a lawyer. He was denied one.
For 2 days, he was interrogated without counsel, without a recording device, in sessions that left no transcripts. Then, on November 24, as he was being transferred from the Dallas City Jail to the county jail, in full view of national television cameras, in the basement of the Dallas Police Department, Jack Ruby stepped out of the crowd and shot him dead. The man who might have spoken was silenced before he could say another word.
Chapter 3. The Shot Heard Round the World.
The physics of assassination are brutally simple. A bullet fired from a rifle travels at speeds exceeding 2,000 feet per second. It crosses the distance between the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository and the presidential limousine, approximately 265 feet at the moment of the fatal shot, in fractions of a second. In that fraction of a second, the world pivoted. But which direction did that bullet travel? From behind, as the Warren Commission concluded, or from in front, from the grassy knoll, as dozens of witnesses and decades of analysis have suggested? The question sounds technical. Its implications are anything but. The Warren Commission's reconstruction of the shooting relied on what has become one of the most contested claims in American forensic history: the single bullet theory. Commission member Arlen Specter, later a U.S. Senator, developed the argument that a single bullet, Commission Exhibit 399, was responsible for 7 separate wounds to 2 men, entering Kennedy's upper back, traveling through his neck, exiting his throat, then entering Governor Connolly's back, shattering the 5th rib, exiting his chest, passing through his right wrist, shattering the radius bone, and finally lodging in his left thigh. For this trajectory to work, the bullet would have had to change direction multiple times in midair, traveling in a Z-shaped path that critics argue is geometrically impossible. Senator Richard Russell, a member of the Warren Commission itself, refused to sign the section of the report endorsing the single bullet theory. He told fellow Commissioner Hale Boggs, "I don't believe it."
The Zapruder film, 26 seconds of home movie footage shot by Dallas dressmaker Abraham Zapruder from a concrete pedestal near the grassy knoll, provides the most visceral evidence in the entire case. Zapruder was filming with a Bell & Howell movie camera, and his footage captured the assassination in graphic, irreducible detail. For years, the film was suppressed. Life magazine purchased it for $150,000 and kept it out of public view until 1975, when Geraldo Rivera broadcast it on national television. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Frame 313, the moment of the fatal headshot, shows Kennedy's head violently snapping backward and to the left. This motion, to many observers, is consistent with a shot from the front right, from the grassy knoll, not from behind where Oswald was positioned. The Warren Commission's explanation that the motion was caused by a neuromuscular reaction has never fully satisfied the physical intuitions of the millions of people who have watched that film. The acoustic evidence gathered by the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1979 appeared to provide scientific confirmation of a second gunman. Analysts studied a dictabelt recording made by a Dallas Police Department motorcycle officer whose radio microphone had been stuck in the open position. Forensic acoustic experts concluded that the recording contained 4 distinct impulse sounds consistent with gunfire, and that one of these sounds originated from the grassy knoll with a probability of 95%. This conclusion was the basis for the HSCA's extraordinary finding that Kennedy had probably been killed as the result of the conspiracy. The National Academy of Sciences, in a 1982 review, disputed this analysis, but the dispute itself was disputed by the original acoustics experts, and the debate has never been fully resolved.
What is not in dispute is the testimony of the eyewitnesses. Dozens of people in Dealey Plaza, bystanders, police officers, Secret Service agents, reported hearing shots from the Grassy Knoll area. Some reported smelling gunpowder near the knoll. Several witnesses ran up the grassy slope toward the picket fence at the top of the knoll immediately after the shots, convinced that the shooting had come from there. They found men who identified themselves as Secret Service agents behind the fence. The problem, the Secret Service later confirmed that all of its agents were either in the motorcade or at Parkland Hospital at the time. No Secret Service agents were stationed behind the Grassy Knoll picket fence. Who were those men? 6 decades later, we still don't know. The physical evidence from Dealey Plaza was compromised almost from the first moments after the shooting. Kennedy's body, in violation of Texas law requiring a local autopsy in all homicide cases, was forcibly removed from Parkland Hospital by Secret Service agents and flown to Washington. The autopsy was conducted at Bethesda Naval Hospital by military doctors who had never performed a forensic autopsy. The lead pathologist burned his original notes. The autopsy photographs and x-rays have been the subject of persistent controversy, with multiple witnesses claiming that the wounds visible in the official autopsy materials do not match what they observed at Parkland. The brain of the president, a critical piece of evidence that could have definitively established the trajectory of the fatal bullet, disappeared from the National Archives sometime in the 1960s. It has never been found.
Chapter 4. The Warren Commission's House of Cards.
When Lyndon Johnson established the Warren Commission on November 29, 1963, exactly 1 week after the assassination, he framed it as a matter of national security. Rumors were circulating: Soviet involvement, Cuban involvement, right-wing conspiracy. Johnson feared that any of these scenarios, if proven, could trigger demands for military retaliation that might escalate to nuclear war. He needed, urgently, an authoritative conclusion. He needed the nation told what to believe. The Warren Commission, he told its members, was not really an investigation. It was a statement of reassurance, and in this sense, it succeeded brilliantly. Its central failure was that it produced a statement of reassurance rather than the truth. The composition of the commission itself was a monument to conflicts of interest so brazen that they would be unthinkable today. Allen Dulles, the former CIA director whom Kennedy had fired after the Bay of Pigs disaster, who reportedly harbored intense personal animosity toward Kennedy, sat on the commission as one of its most active members. He controlled what information about CIA activities was shared with the other commissioners. The Rockefeller-connected internationalist John J. McCloy was a longtime intelligence community insider. Representative Gerald Ford was later revealed to have been an FBI informant, secretly reporting on the commission's internal deliberations to J. Edgar Hoover. The FBI, which had its own institutional reasons to deflect attention from any prior awareness of Oswald, was the primary investigative agency feeding information to the commission. It was, in the most literal sense, the investigators investigating themselves.
The Commission's methodology was deeply flawed in ways that became apparent almost immediately after the report's publication. Chief Counsel J. Lee Rankin later admitted that he had operated with a presumption of Oswald's guilt from the beginning, essentially reverse engineering the investigation to support a predetermined conclusion. Witnesses who contradicted the lone gunman narrative were given brief hearings and then ignored. Commission members had access to virtually none of the CIA's files on Oswald, files that existed, that were extensive, and that the CIA actively concealed. The commission never learned that the CIA had been running active assassination plots against Fidel Castro at the time of Kennedy's murder, plots that involved figures like Johnny Rosselli and Santos Trafficante, who would later be named as persons of interest in JFK's own death. This information, which should have been central to any serious investigation, was withheld. The report, published September 24, 1964, ran to 889 pages and 26 volumes of supporting evidence. It was released to a nation desperate for closure, desperate to believe that a lone, disturbed young man had killed their president, because the alternative, a conspiracy, implied a darkness in American institutions that was too frightening to contemplate. For a few years, the official conclusion held. Then the cracks began to appear. Mark Lane, a New York lawyer who had represented Oswald's mother at commission hearings, published Rush to Judgment in 1966, a meticulously documented critique of the commission's methods and conclusions that became an immediate bestseller. Within months, polls showed that a majority of Americans no longer believed the Warren Commission. The figure has never returned to a majority believing the official account in the 6 decades since.
Chapter 5. The Grassy Knoll, a Second Gunman.
Stand in Dealey Plaza today and you will feel it immediately. A sense of wrongness about the geometry. A nagging intuition that the official narrative doesn't quite fit the physical space. The Texas School Book Depository sits at the corner of Houston and Elm Streets, its 6th-floor windows looking down at the motorcade route at an angle that forced the presidential limousine to move away from the gunman's line of sight as it traveled down Elm Street. Ballistic experts and military snipers who have analyzed the shooting scenario generally agree that the shot that killed Kennedy, the fatal headshot, would have been far more difficult from the depository than from the Grassy Knoll, which provided a direct frontal angle to the limousine as it descended Elm Street. The Grassy Knoll, with its wooden picket fence providing concealment and its parking lot offering an escape route, was, from a tactical standpoint, the better shooting position. The physical evidence from the knoll is fragmentary but suggestive. A photograph taken by bystander Mary Mormon at the moment of the fatal headshot appears to show, in a grainy enhancement of the area behind the picket fence, a figure that some analysts have called the Badge Man, a shape that seems to depict a uniformed figure at a shooting position behind the fence. The enhancement is disputed. Photographic analysts disagree fiercely about what the image shows, but it exists. It cannot be explained away. Another photograph, taken by Phil Willis, captures figures on the grassy slope at the moment of the shots. Multiple witnesses who rushed to the top of the knoll immediately after the shooting found fresh footprints and cigarette butts in the mud behind the fence. Evidence, they believed, that someone had been standing there.
The most dramatic witness testimony regarding the Grassy Knoll comes from the Dealey Plaza bystanders themselves, cataloged in extraordinary detail by researchers over the decades. Of 104 witnesses whose testimony was recorded, the majority reported hearing shots from the general area of the Grassy Knoll, or believed the shots came from in front of the limousine rather than from behind it. Railroad Supervisor S.M. Holland, watching from the rail overpass above Elm Street, watched the motorcade approach and then heard shots that he was absolutely certain came from behind the picket fence. He ran up the knoll after the shooting and found fresh footprints and muddy impressions on the bumper of a car parked in the area, as if someone had been standing on the bumper to look over the fence. Holland's testimony was corroborated by multiple colleagues watching from the same overpass. What would a second gunman scenario have looked like? The hypothesis, advanced by researchers ranging from academic historians to former intelligence operatives, suggests a professional operation, at least 2 shooters carefully positioned to create a crossfire.
The shot or shots from the depository, from Oswald's position, or from a position near it, would draw attention upward and to the left rear of the motorcade. The fatal shot from the grassy knoll would come simultaneously or in rapid succession from the front right, ensuring that even if one gunman missed or was identified, the other would complete the mission. Oswald, whether he fired or not, would be the designated Patsy, a man with a manufactured radical biography, a paper trail of Marxist sympathies, Soviet connections, and Cuban associations that would make him the perfect lone nut.
Chapter 6. Jack Ruby and the Silencing of Oswald.
At 11:21 a.m. on November 24, 1963, Jack Ruby, born Jacob Leon Rubenstein, Dallas nightclub owner, small-time underworld figure, man of violent impulses and deep mob connections, stepped out from a crowd of reporters and police officers in the basement of the Dallas Police Department and fired a single bullet into Lee Harvey Oswald's abdomen. The shooting was witnessed live by millions of Americans watching on television. It was, in the words of one commentator, the most public murder in history. It was also, to conspiracy researchers, the most suspicious, because of all the people in Dallas, in all of America, Jack Ruby was among the last people who should have been in that basement at that moment, with that gun, in a position to silence the one man who might have blown the entire conspiracy wide open. Ruby's connection to the Dallas underworld was well documented and extensive. He had grown up in Chicago, running errands for Al Capone's organization as a teenager. In Dallas, he operated the Carousel Club, a strip joint frequented by off-duty police officers and known as a meeting point for local organized crime. His FBI file, declassified decades after his death, shows contact with numerous figures connected to the major crime families: Carlos Marcello's New Orleans organization, Santos Traficante's Tampa network, and Sam Giancon's Chicago outfit. Ruby had, according to FBI records, participated in gun-running operations to Cuba in the late 1950s, operations that intersected with CIA-backed anti-Castro exile groups. In the months before the assassination, Ruby made an unusual number of phone calls to major organized crime figures, a pattern that investigators found deeply suspicious.
How did Ruby get into the basement? This is the question that the official account has never satisfactorily answered. The Dallas police basement was supposedly a secured area, the transfer of a presidential assassination suspect in the glare of national television in a city still convulsed with shock and grief should have been the most carefully controlled operation imaginable. And yet Ruby, a man known to Dallas police, friendly with many officers, a regular at the station who brought sandwiches and coffee to detectives, had no difficulty gaining access. He later claimed to have walked in through a ramp entrance that was left unguarded. The officer who was supposed to be watching that entrance had left his post. Whether this was negligence, coincidence, or orchestrated remains one of the permanent mysteries of the case. Ruby's behavior in the aftermath of the shooting was the behavior of a man who feared what he knew. When members of the Warren Commission visited him in jail, Ruby made a remarkable request. He wanted to be taken to Washington, where he could speak freely. "I want to tell the truth," he told Chief Justice Earl Warren, "and I can't tell it here." Earl Warren refused to transport him. Ruby then told Warren directly, "If you don't take me back to Washington tonight to give me a chance to prove to the president that I was not part of any conspiracy to kill the president, you will see the most tragic thing you have ever seen." He said his life was in danger. He said there were people who would kill him to prevent him from talking. Earl Warren left Ruby in Dallas. Ruby died of cancer in January 1967, never giving a full accounting of his actions. He never answered the question that will follow his name forever. Who sent Jack Ruby into that base?
Chapter 7. Who really pulled the trigger?
6 decades of investigation, declassification, witness testimony, acoustic analysis, photographic enhancement, and philosophical debate have produced not one definitive answer, but a constellation of competing theories, each with its own evidence, its own logic, its own adherents, and its own terrifying implications. The question of who killed John F. Kennedy is not simply a historical puzzle. It is a mirror held up to American power, reflecting back the image of an establishment so riddled with competing interests, so capable of violence, so practiced in deception, that any several scenarios is not merely plausible, but, to serious researchers, probable. The CIA theory has perhaps the most sophisticated evidential foundation. Kennedy had, in the 3 years of his presidency, made the CIA his most formidable institutional enemy. He had shut down the Bay of Pigs invasion at the critical moment, causing the capture and humiliation of exile-trained fighters. He had fired Director Allen Dulles and promised to scatter the CIA to the winds. He was exploring back-channel negotiations with Fidel Castro that would have ended the very operations, sabotage, assassination attempts, exile training that consumed enormous CIA resources and defined the careers of dozens of agency officers. These men, David Phillips, David Morales, William Harvey, and others whose names populate the investigative literature, were not bureaucrats. They were trained killers, men who organized assassinations as a matter of professional practice, men who believed, with the absolute certainty of true believers, that Kennedy's accommodations with the communist world were acts of treason that would destroy everything they had given their lives to protect.
The organized crime theory identifies a motive so concrete that it can be expressed in dollars. The mob had lost billions in Cuban casino revenues when Castro came to power in 1959, and it had spent those revenues funding CIA-backed exile groups in the expectation of a reinvasion that would restore their gambling empire. Robert Kennedy's Justice Department had then declared war on organized crime, threatening the entire apparatus. Carlos Marcello, who controlled organized crime from New Orleans to Dallas, was overheard by an FBI informant in September 1962, making threats against the president. Santos Traficante told a Cuban exile associate in 1961, "Kennedy's not gonna make it to the election. He is going to be hit." These are not the musings of crackpots. They are documented statements by men who had the resources, the connections, and the demonstrated willingness to engage in exactly this kind of political murder. The Lyndon Johnson theory is the most politically explosive and circumstantially rich. Johnson had strong motive. Kennedy had reportedly told close associates that he intended to replace Johnson on the 1964 ticket, a move that would have ended Johnson's political career and potentially exposed him to criminal investigations that were closing in from multiple directions. Johnson had the connections, his long relationship with Texas oil interests, his friendship with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, his intimate knowledge of the Dallas political apparatus. The military-industrial complex theory connects the assassination to the broadest possible institutional forces. Kennedy had signed National Security Action Memorandum 263, which called for the withdrawal of 1,000 U.S. military advisors from Vietnam by the end of 1963. 3 days after Kennedy's assassination, Johnson signed NSAM 273, reversing the withdrawal policy. The Vietnam War that followed, with its 58,000 American dead and its hundreds of billions in defense contracts, was the war that Kennedy was apparently trying to prevent.
Chapter 8: 60 Years of Unanswered Questions.
On March 18, 2025, the Biden administration released what was described as the final major tranche of declassified JFK assassination documents. Nearly 1 million pages of CIA, FBI, and other government records accumulated over 6 decades. Researchers and journalists descended on the archives with the fervor of archaeologists opening a pharaoh's tomb. What they found was not a smoking gun, but something in some ways more disturbing. Confirmation after confirmation of the institutional deceptions, the operational connections, the suppressed evidence and managed narratives that conspiracy researchers had been documenting for decades, without the one definitive document that would close the case forever. The CIA had been monitoring Oswald's Soviet and Cuban contacts far more extensively than it had acknowledged to the Warren Commission. The FBI had indeed had an informant relationship with Oswald that it concealed. The connections between Ruby's associates and major crime figures were even more extensive than previously documented. And yet, no document but said in unambiguous language, "Here is who ordered the killing of John F. Kennedy." This absence, the absence of the definitive document, is itself interpreted in radically different ways by different researchers. To those who maintain Oswald acted alone, it is simply the expected result. There is no smoking gun because there was no conspiracy. To those who believe in a conspiracy, the absence of documentation is entirely consistent with how professional intelligence operations are conducted. Nothing is committed to paper, orders are given in person, cutouts are used to insulate the principals, and deniability is maintained at every level. The most sophisticated operations leave no paper trails precisely because their architects understood from the beginning that history would eventually demand answers.
What has been established beyond reasonable dispute in 6 decades of investigation is this: Lee Harvey Oswald was not the simple, transparent figure the Warren Commission presented. He had intelligence connections that were never fully explained and that the CIA actively concealed. The Dallas Police Department handling of Oswald's custody was marked by procedural failures so numerous and so consequential that they either represent an extraordinary accumulation of incompetence or something considerably more deliberate. Jack Ruby was connected to organized crime in ways that his proximity to Oswald cannot be explained by coincidence alone. The Warren Commission operated under constraints, political, institutional, and operational, that prevented it from conducting the thorough, independent investigation its mandate required. And the subsequent investigation by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the only official body to examine the evidence without the political imperatives that shaped the Warren Commission, concluded that a conspiracy probably existed. The cultural weight of the JFK assassination is immeasurable. It marks for millions of Americans the precise moment when official America lost its credibility, the moment when the gap between what powerful institutions said and what they actually knew or did became visible and irreducible. Every subsequent conspiracy theory in American life, Watergate, Iran-Contra, 9/11, the deep state, the surveillance state, traces a line back to November 22, 1963. And so the questions remain. Who fired the shots in Dealey Plaza? Was there a conspiracy? And if so, who were its architects? What did Lee Harvey Oswald really know? What do the still withheld documents contain?
These are not merely historical questions. They are questions about the nature of power in a democratic society, about whether the mechanisms of government can ever be fully transparent to the people they claim to serve. The shot fired in Dealey Plaza on November 22, 1963, is still echoing. 60 years later, we are still listening for the answer.